This is the very first AMA that we're having with an immigrant mentor, and the second AMA that we're having as a community. So I'm so excited that Anu Ramakrishnan, who is an EB-1A Einstein visa recipient, who's going to be joining us for this AMA. Anu is currently working as a senior director of product management at Applied Cognition. But honestly, when I met her, it felt like Anu just does so many different things outside of her job that I was surprised that she actually has a full-time job and has a family to manage and is currently helping other immigrants get their EB-1 visa. So Anu, it gives me so much pleasure that you are the first person that we're interviewing on this. Welcome, and please come on stage, and we'd love to talk to you about your journey.
Thank you so much, Soundarya. That was an amazing introduction, probably more than what I deserve, but thank you. Appreciate that.
If you don't mind, I'd love to, you kind of told me over a, one-on-one about why you applied for the EB-1, and it was a very interesting story. So do you mind just briefly sharing why you even began thinking about this visa?
Yeah, definitely. So just for some context, I actually came to the United States in 2009 when I was just 17 years old. And I came here to pursue my undergrad in biomedical engineering. And I stayed on to do my master's and then joined the workforce in 2015, losing track of time. And so I had a couple of years on OPT and then, got a chance to get my case picked on the lottery for the H-1B and then basically worked on an H-1B for, a few years. And then it was only at that point that I really started to understand a little bit more about what I wanted to do with my career. Where did I want to take things as far as like my product management career in terms of, growth opportunities and things like that. And I realized how limiting my visa was in this whole process, like in helping me achieve my dreams. And so I think I kind of made peace with it for the most part. But in 2020, I actually had my baby and I came back from maternity leave, all excited to get back into the workforce and continue on this amazing project that I was working on. And my manager pulled me into a one-on-one and said, hey, I'm sorry that this is the news I have to share with you as soon as you come back from leave. But, the whole team is going to get scrapped in 3 months. And so you're kind of on your own to start looking for opportunities. And I don't know if any of you here are new moms or have been through this process before, but nobody wants to hear about an impending layoff as soon as they're back from maternity leave. So it was definitely like one of the lowest points in my recent career for sure. And it was really at that point that, I think I was fairly confident I would be able to find a job, but like, I just wasn't, able to fathom that at some point, if I don't find a job in the next 60 days, I would be at the risk of getting deported back to my country. And also I have a little kid who was dependent on her mom. So there were so many logistical things to think about. And so it was really at that moment that I decided that, hey, you know what? I think this immigration constraint needs to go away for good. And I'm going to find whatever it takes to get out of this, situation. So it was really at that moment I started to research paths that I could leverage with, my skills and my experiences, but at the same time, paths that would give me a leverage being an Indian-born immigrant. And that's when, I had heard about the EB-1A. It's not that I wasn't aware of that path, but I think just like a lot of others, I always kind of brush it off as like, oh, it was something that is typically only meant for, researchers or people in academia. And obviously as a product manager, I'm not going to be able to qualify. And so I think my first big step was to get over that imposter syndrome and really sort of break new path. And understand what my options are as far as applying for an EB-1A with a product management background. So yeah, that's kind of my story in terms of at least how I stumbled upon the EB-1 and what was my motivation for pursuing that.
Thank you so much. I actually think a lot of people here can resonate, if not with the maternity leave part, but just the idea of getting laid off, just given how the situation has been the last 9 months.
Yep.
So. And I also think, I don't know if anyone on the call here is thinking of the EB-1, from a similar standpoint as to trying to not be in such a precarious position that you have to leave in 60 days. And that was your motivation. If it is, just put that in chat. But I would love to dedicate the rest of this call to answering questions that come from the audience. And I'm going to kick off with the first question that I'm seeing here.
Mm-hmm.
So Sharat Kumar is asking, I'm on the EB2 track and currently working in a mid-sized biotech firm. I'm interested in accelerating my career towards the EB1 and would like to know the following. The first question is, I hear about adding value to the organization and working on critical projects as a criteria to build the EB1. Can you help simplify what these mean based on your experience?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for that great question. So let me first start off by talking about just impact at work, and then I can talk about specifically what to leverage from an EB-1A perspective. So first of all, I think it's always a good idea to be in a position where you're making impact in an organization, right? So what that means is try to identify projects that would essentially give you a fast track to growth, would really put you in an uncomfortable situation so that you get an opportunity to really learn and grow. And that's honestly when you're going to make the most impact. From an EB-1A perspective, again, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't speak from the law point of view, but from my understanding and my own experience, basically what they're looking for is, have you used your expertise in a certain area to make an impact at organizations which are also distinguished in your industry? And so let me break that down a little bit, because I know it's a lot of words. So there are a couple of things that are important here, right? So the first thing is you want to make sure that, from an EB-1A perspective, you want to first make sure you're applying in an area that is where you've spent the most amount of time building credible work. So in your case, obviously, if you've been in biotech for a considerable amount of time, then, it is organic for you to think that, biotech industry, and, I don't know specifically what you do there, but for example, if it's product management, then you could say product management in biotech could be like your industry focus, right? And so it's important that you demonstrate projects in your leading and critical role that also fall in that same intersection. That's number one. And the second thing is you also want to think about how to represent your company as a distinguished organization. And this doesn't necessarily mean working in a big company or like a Fortune 100 company, but it's important that you have ways to showcase how the company has made impact in your field. So things that you can use to do that are has the company won awards in your field? Have they been first to market to launch something? Do they have a lot of patents in the industry? Those are all metrics that USCIS uses to evaluate if your company is a distinguished organization. The next part is where you come in, where you need to prove that you have actually done impactful work in that company. And also, in a sense, what you want to show is that without you, those projects would have not been successful, right? And I think that's a very important distinction to make, because there is a big difference between being just a product manager and delivering shipping features and being one of many people who could do that, versus being a very, very critical resource in that project and driving decisions, taking a lot of leadership and ownership to doing that, right? So that's kind of really what they're looking for. And also making sure that you have very measurable ways to show impact. And so there's a big portion of your recommendation letters which are going to talk about what tangible impact you made to an organization. And so this could be things like, has your product or project resulted in a tangible or a measurable increase in revenue for the company? Has it resulted in new growth opportunities? Have you, using your product and your skills, have you been able to launch something that's first to market? So those are the sort of traits of a good project to use for your leading and critical role. But ultimately, I think, honestly, from my experience, it came down to having really solid mentors and supervisors who could vouch for you and sign off on letters which would put you in good light, right? Because these letters are very comprehensive. They're not like your H-1B, EB-2 skills letters. They're very comprehensive. Just for an understanding of length, they go about 5 to 6 pages each. So yes, you want to make sure that you have advocates who are willing to represent you and put you in good light.
Thanks a lot, Anu. I think like, what I'm hearing is it's twofold, right? First, you have to show that you worked on critical projects in your specific niche. And
Yep.
second, your organization is distinguished. I have a follow-up to that, which I think Sharat will also know about is, can you specifically and briefly just talk about what was the project that you put forth for a critical project? Like, can you share without maybe revealing any confidential information there?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can share an example of a project that is actually public information. So I was actually a product manager at Samsung Health, and I was working on an enterprise product, which just to kind of talk a little bit more about that, we were actually the first company to demonstrate that cardiac rehabilitation could be done virtually using wearables like smartwatches. And we had a very tangible impact to show for that. So we actually were the first company to work with a large health medical organization like Kaiser to essentially implement the solution and also scale it from a small pilot of 30 participants to over 8,000 patients in a span of 2 years. So if you think about the impact there, right? So we had very tangible customer growth. We had very measurable impact to revenue. And because of, the fact that we had the ability to collaborate with these big names in healthcare, we also got written about in several top journals like Nature and JAMA. And then also we had press releases on Wall Street Journal and places like that. So that was like a very, it was an excellent project to use for the leading critical role, just from like the impact it made.
And so, I mean, you were a key part of this project, and were you mentioned in any of these press articles, or you got a letter from internal management?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually, I wasn't mentioned on any of the press. And what is important for the critical role category is, again, the letters of recommendations, right? So I was able to get a letter from my supervisor to say that I was the only PM leading that product. And, I had all these responsibilities of like setting the vision, building the roadmap, working with an engineering team of like 40 engineers and, 5 designers and so on and so forth. And, basically going into the tactics of whatever I did. So that's the way you kind of bridge the gap. And so, yeah, I think that's like a good myth we busted right there. So for your leading a critical role category, you don't need to have press that has your name mentioned. I mean, if you do, that's great, but it's not required.
Right. Awesome. I think that was my clarification. I'm really glad you mentioned that. Anirudh is asking, it's more generic. He's asking, how did you start with your EB-1 journey? Where did you begin to understand your profile and how you fit the criteria? I think something that, we can rephrase this as, how did you know where you are and how much gap you had to go to? What was that self-assessment like?
Yeah, honestly, it was a very, very hard process. And honestly, one of the big reasons for that is there were just no resources. It was a lot of like me trying to do my own research and figure that out. But the way I sort of went about it was taking a bit of a bottom-up approach. So I looked at everything that I had achieved at the time. So I think at that point I was probably 5 to 6 years into my full-time career. And so I looked back and thought about, hey, like, here are all the work projects I've done. Here's all the like extracurricular stuff that I worked on, like my speaking events. I had writing, I had, some courses that I had created, things like that. And really then started a bit of a mapping exercise. So mapping meaning starting to look at the criteria and then trying to first get more information on what each of them really wanted. And then doing a bit of a gap analysis, right? So that was sort of like how I started that process. And honestly, like at the time, I think the only option I had was to go to a lawyer and like do as many of these like consultations as possible to get a sense of where I stand. And honestly, that was the closest I had to like, a self-assessment, right? So the problem with that is I think lawyers are great where they help you. Like if you present them a bunch of stuff, they'll be like, oh, this will work, but this is going to be weak evidence. But you'll also hear very different things from two different people. So it was definitely a bit of a challenge to like really think about, okay, who do I go after? What advice do I go after? But the thing that I took away is like, if 2 or more lawyers said the same thing, then it's very likely that there's a gap, right? And I need to work on that. So that was really how I distilled, my profile and understood where I need to spend more time.
Maybe just quick questions is, how many lawyers did you speak with, and how much do you spend on just consultations at that point, if you remember?
Yeah, so I actually thought about this like a product manager, and I was like, how can I spend the least amount of money and get the most amount of information? So I only picked the lawyers who did free consultations just because I didn't want to pay like $200 for a 15-30-minute session. Right. And so that automatically kind of maybe weeded out some of the good ones. But interestingly, a lot of good lawyers actually do free consultations. And that was a big learning for me. But yeah, unfortunately, they weren't people like coaches and, advisors who could be kind of the middleman at that point. So I just had to rely on, what was the best option.
So you spoke to 3 lawyers, 5?
Yeah.
Lawyers?
So how many? I think I spoke to about 5. 5 lawyers, and then ended up going with one of them.
Got it.
In my case, yeah.
Great. Next question I see is on something, the Kazarian, which is the final merits determination. So for those who might not be aware, with EB-1, there is a step 2 analysis. Beyond meeting 3 of the 10 criteria, you also have to be deemed extraordinary in the eyes of the officer in a more holistic sense. And so the question is, what is needed for that final merits determination for a product manager based on your experience? Maybe you can just list out a few things that you added for that.
Yeah, so the final merit section actually has 4 important components. The first one is an intent letter, which is probably the simplest of all, which is, in your own words, writing to USCIS to say like why you should be deserving of a permanent residency. The second thing is expert letters of recommendation. So this is where you want to be able to get at least 3 to 5 experts in your industry to vouch for your holistic expertise in the area. And so that was another important aspect of the final merits, which took time and effort. The third thing is sort of that national interest determination, right? So yes, the EB-1A is different from it's not the same thing as an NIW in the sense like you don't necessarily have to be in a field that is of urgent importance to the US, but the more you can present your field as one that is going to benefit the US economy, the better. So there was a little bit of research that I did with my lawyers to validate why digital health and therapeutics was an important industry and how can that benefit the US economy. And then the last thing is kind of this catch-all bucket is how I like to call it, where you can use any evidence that can put you in good light as a product manager, right? So the things that I actually used were in that section were anything that I had as like spillover evidence that didn't fit into any one specific category. So to give you an example, I had a bunch of different speaking events that I had done in digital health. And unfortunately, I couldn't use any of them in in building any of my 10 criteria. So I put all of them in the final merits, used a lot of like pictures and marketing collateral, things like that. Yeah, the second thing I had was I actually had created a course through product school. Again, very, very high impact course, had a lot of students, things like that, but I couldn't use it in any category specifically. So I put that in there. But surprisingly, even little things like, I had testimonials and I had like kudos notes from people at work, like saying, hey, Anu, great job on this release, like fantastic contribution, so on and so forth. I'm so thankful that I took screenshots of all of those things. So big tip for everyone, just screenshot everything, even if you don't think it's going to be helpful, because you never know when you're going to need it. I used a ton of those things as well in my final merits to really show like holistic coverage across the board. And I think that was really helpful.
That's actually very helpful. The fact that you used screenshots. Yeah. And also, I would think reviews from people who took your product school course.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, literally anything that doesn't fit under the criteria that you have evidence for, just put them under final merits. We have a lot of questions, so let's try to power through the rest if we can. Yeah. Johnny is asking about press coverage. So did you get press? Was that one of the criteria you satisfied by those?
No, so I actually didn't do any press coverage. The reason for that was, so I had some press for my product. So I leveraged a lot of that, but I didn't have anything that had my name or like I didn't have interviews or features. And my thought process for that was I realized, early on that like I would have to work with a PR firm to get a lot of those done. And I didn't want to invest that kind of money unless there was a strong need for it. So I decided my phase one would be try to attempt the low-hanging fruit first that you definitely meet. And then if there was an RFE or there was a need for more evidence building, I would invest and build more PR. So that's proof that you don't need PR to get an EB-1A.
Yes. And in Johnny's case, Johnny is asking specifically if, there's any tips for press coverage. I think just my 2 cents there is, if you're not willing to go through a PR firm, Johnny, I would say that social media can be a good tool. And I'm saying this because, the more you publish your work and research on social media, I do think it gets recognized by eventually a journalist or someone who knows a journalist. So at least in my case, I've certainly published a lot on social media, which has gotten the attention of some journalists. So that's been helpful. Just wanted to mention that.
Yeah.
Jeet says, hey, Anu, super encouraging to listen to your story and your success. This might be a repetition of the previous question, which is, I'd like to know where you started your EB-1 journey. You answered that already. Maybe you can talk about how helpful were your past and current companies to building your profile? Like, did you use a lot of the work that you did at the companies in your EB-1 or outside the companies?
Yeah, actually, it was very useful, primarily because I think in my case, and I totally understand that not everybody has a similar path, but even though I only had 5-6 years of experience, all of the experience I had was very relevant to my niche. So I was able to leverage all of that in building my profile and, ultimately submitting my EB-1A case. So yeah, in my case, it was yes. And it was a mix of like big companies and small companies and medium size. So I had, companies like Samsung and Genentech in there, but I also had like mid-sized companies like iRhythm and, a couple of other smaller startups that I had worked at. So and you don't have to use everything. That's another thing. Like you have the authority to cherry pick the best projects that'll put you in best light.
Fantastic. Next question I see is, Anirudh is asking, how do you navigate confidentiality? As in, was your employer fine with disclosing the impact in terms of revenue for your work? It's a good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it really depends on the company. So Samsung, for example, was not okay with disclosing revenue numbers. But the way I worked around that was to show percent change, right? So yes, I could not disclose exactly how many $1 million of ARR we had, but I could showcase the improvement from when I started to when I was at that point, right? So it was like, either a 10x increase or like, 150% increase in revenue, whatever that is. So that's another clever way of like trying to still show the impact and significance of it without actually disclosing numbers.
So you didn't disclose the numbers, but you talked about the delta, like
exactly,
the increase from last time. That's clever. Sharat says, fantastic response, Anu. That helped me a lot for one of the previous responses. Or is to reference letters? Do they all need to be from my current employer?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if it's, I'm assuming these are about the letters of reference for your leading and critical role. It is preferred that the people who sign off on your letters still work at the company that it's not required that you still work there, but the letter should ideally be from people who supervised you at the time you were there and also continue to still work at the company. But it's perfectly understandable that that's not realistic. So if that is the case where, let's say, your supervisor has also moved on, you can definitely still get a letter from them and then supplement with a copy of their LinkedIn or resume just to validate that, they did work in that company.
Interesting. As a follow-up, how many letters did you get in total? And who are they from?
Yeah. So for my leading and critical role, I did the minimum. So it was like 2 projects that showcase both leading and critical roles. And so I did both the leading and critical, but I had 2 projects and they were from 2 different companies. In terms of the people who signed off, they were definitely very senior. So I had the VP of product at both the companies write my letters.
Nice. And besides the companies, did you get letters from any experts in the field?
Yeah. So for my expert letters, I have a bit of a different approach here. So ideally, you want to find people who are an expert in your field, but also know you at least to some extent, because it is very difficult to actually go to people who don't know you at all and like ask them to write a long letter about why you're so great. So I try to find as much of an intersection as possible. So thankfully, again, I had a good network that I could rely on. So I had people I knew, still working at the same company, but not directly in my team. So VPs of product. I went to like a chief medical officer at Samsung Health. I went to the VP of product at Genentech. So either in the product vertical or in the medical clinical vertical. And I had those folks write my expert letters.
Awesome. So they were all people kind of at the companies you worked in, not really.
Yes. Actually, yeah, they were all in the companies I worked at. Yeah.
Bhavan asked the question, and I'm curious if you know about the EB-1B that much. He's asking that Bhavan is an AI researcher at Amazon. Mm-hmm. He's working towards his EB-1B petition. So EB-1B is for outstanding professors and researchers with a big law firm hired by my employer. How different are the bars for EB-1A versus B for a researcher? And I find the lawyers to be quite incompetent. Any suggestions about that?
Honestly, I don't know if I'm the best person to answer that question. I don't know, maybe Soundarya, do you have more context there?
So in terms of the bar for EB-1A and B, I can't speak about that. But I do think if you're a researcher, in the eyes of the officer, it just makes sense for you to go through the EB-1B route than the EB-1A, because EB-1B, you only have to meet 2 out of 6 criteria. EB-1A is 3 out of 10. So by that standard, I think the bar is just lower there.
And also, I don't think the EB-1B has final merits, right?
I think all of them have, including the O1. Even the O1 has a second step analysis. But Bhavan, regarding the lawyers part, maybe you can reach out to me later on. And, we have a few lawyers that we're adding to our community next week. So you can get a free consult with one of them and talk through this. Johnny is asking a follow-up. Do you have any recommendations for lawyers who do free consultations or where we can find them? So I'll just start by saying we are adding a few lawyers within our community next week who are going to offer, some of whom will offer free consults. But beyond that, do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, so I'll talk about my approach. I basically just went on Google and searched for EB-1A lawyers and then literally cold emailed a bunch of them to see what their consultation fees were and what was their process. I can share the lawyer I worked with. I mean, I'm not affiliated to them in any way, but I worked with Breakthrough USA. They're a firm based in LA. The chief lawyer there is called Chris Ingram. But yeah, I basically picked them because they were the only folks who actually had represented product managers and like business folks like me. So pick them over the others. But yeah, I think cold emailing might be a good place to start.
And as a quick follow-up, Anu, someone asked about the cost for an EB-1A. So if you don't mind sharing how much you paid Breakthrough USA and what was your total cost?
Yeah, I think what you put there is like right within the ballpark. So yeah, I paid about between 11 to 12,000 for my legal fees, and then since I did premium, I had about 3,000 to 4,000 in the filing fees and premium processing costs. So yeah, right around like 15 to 16,000.
Yeah, and I know that some lawyers might charge more if you get an RFE. So ask the lawyer up front if they do that.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Yeah, you should definitely ask about RFEs. I also realized that some lawyers charge more depending on the number of categories you apply for. For example, Chris Ingram actually, they have a flat fee for 3, but then any additional categories, another like 2,000. So I ended up actually doing 4, so I had to pay a little bit more.
Okay.
Yeah, the RFE is a good one. Definitely check on that.
Priya is asking, after you got the EB-1, did you have an obligation to remain in the field or organization you got it approved for? It's actually I've never heard that question before.
It's actually a very important one. So there is a obligation to stay in the same field until you get your green card in hand. In fact, as I mentioned, one of the requirements in the Kazarian analysis is to include an intent letter that validates that you will continue to work in your field after you get the green card. So it is highly recommended that you stick to the same line of work. Of course, after you have the green card, nobody's really auditing you. You're free to do what you want. But you could get an interview in your 485 process, and they might ask you where you work, and you don't want to be in a precarious situation at that point.
I just want to tell audience that Anu is still working her full-time job, but she
yeah.
also began coaching on the side for other people who are potentially EB-1 aspirants. So that's something you can start doing, right? These side hustles.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, like I chose to be in healthcare, so I'm still here, but there's no like as I said, like once you have a green card, you're free to do what you want.
Right.
So you're welcome to change fields as well.
Okay, a few more quick questions. Manoj is asking, how many criteria do you recommend to meet? Any thoughts on scholarly articles / publications? Did you apply for scholarly articles criteria?
Yeah, so how many criteria do you recommend to meet? I would say, I mean, this is my N of 1 recommendation, but I generally thought that going with fewer categories was better, and like going really deep and, preparing a solid like case for each category was a better approach than doing as many as possible. So in that note, I did 4 categories so that I have one backup. And I did do scholarly articles, and that was only because that was actually my bonus category. And the only reason I did that was because I already had a bunch of articles, both on Medium and also in a bunch of like tech and healthcare media sources. Again, those were, I didn't have any articles on Forbes or Business Insider and places like that. It was mostly like specific media that was either in entrepreneurship or in healthcare. And I think that's relevant because what they care about is not so much like how well your article does specifically, but they care that you write about topics that are in your field and also get published in media that have a high impact factor. And high impact meaning like have at least over 5 to 10 million MAUs in viewership.
5 to 10 million?
Mm-hmm.
It's actually higher than I would have expected. Interesting.
Yeah, it is. It is high. It is definitely high. So, but the one thing I will say is that Medium can be tricky, right? Because it worked for me, I think, because I didn't get an RFE on my case. But I do know that depending on the officer and how like savvy they are, they know that the bar to writing on Medium is not super high. So you can use Medium, but try to supplement with something that has a bit of a review process and like a higher bar.
This is from Anirudh. He's asking, how helpful was Saiman Shetty's course / advice? Did you take Saiman's course yourself? Do you have any advice?
No, so no, I didn't take his course because I think it launched after I got my EB-1. So in terms of like his course, what I know from like having briefly worked with him is that it's basically, you can think of it as like a resource handbook, right? So he has a bunch of lectures and content on how you can start building evidence for every category. But beyond that, it's not a coaching program. So you're not going to get like one-on-one attention, or, he's not really looking to provide that sort of a service. And it's also not an outsourced kind of program where like, you just buy the course and, he or his team will do the work behind the scenes. So yeah, regarding helpfulness, I'm not sure if I can answer that from personal experience, but that's the intent of the course.
Got it. If you have a follow-up on that, let us know, Anirudh. And Rahul is asking, did you leverage your membership in any associations? So memberships, as I've heard many times, is one of the harder categories to...
Yeah.
Just because, which organizations publishes bylaws for how to get it? Not many do. So did you even shoot for that in the first place? I
actually didn't. And that was exactly why, because the bar is really high and you need at least two different memberships. So I think I was at a point where I could have possibly gotten a membership to Forbes Technology Council. But even then it would have just been one. So I was like, not worth it. I'll probably do it if I get an RFE, but I didn't do it for my petition.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I got the same feedback from pretty much every lawyer that I've spoken to. Like, unless you're part of senior member at IEEE, or like British Computer Society, it might not be as worth it to go for that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
All right, Sanika is asking, I'm applying for an EB-1A with my research work and PhD. I need a letter of recommendation from people who I didn't work with and can write about my work impact. Did you write similar LORs? I think she's asking, like, how can I get letters from people that I did not work with, who can still write about my work and its impact?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I can speak from personal experience, because what my lawyers told me was it's best to get letters from people who have supervised your work. And the letter will actually state like how they supervised you and in what capacity. So I'm not really sure if like getting a letter from someone else who's reviewed your work would still be applicable. I don't want to give you like, wrong advice. So, but yes, I in my case, I only use people who supervise my work directly.
Awesome. This is more of a rhetoric question, I think. How do you manage all of this? Begging for tips, asked by Jeet Gupta. So,
how do you manage all of this? Honestly, the EB-1A was like another full-time job. I'm not even kidding. I think more than the evidence generation part, I just realized like how much I had to project manage my lawyers to like spend the time working on my case and actually make progress. And it was, as I mentioned, like I had to do a lot of research on my own, even though I had a lawyer. So my advice would be like, yes, work with a lawyer for sure, but don't just let them run with your case. Like still have complete ownership of it as much as possible, and like read all your arguments, reread it. Something that I actually did, which was incredibly helpful, was before my letters and stuff actually went into the petition, I had some friends who don't work in healthcare read these letters so that I could get a bit of like a layman's perspective on gaps, things that like, were confusing to them, as like an example of what might potentially confuse the officer. So I think that's a good tip for anyone who's thinking about going through this path. But yeah, no tips for how to manage stuff. It is a bit of a roller coaster.
Everyone that I've spoken to about this, I think they always say that like working towards a talent visa was like a marathon. And while in the marathon, I think you become numb to the amount of work after a while. And then you realize the toll it took on, I guess, your physical and mental self. But then everyone's always like, it was worth it. It's like, I got here because of the...
Yeah. And I will also say this. I feel like the people who actually make it out to the end are people who are very, very sure of why they want to get the green card and want to make it happen at all costs. And that's exactly how you become numb to the pain, because you're like, okay, if this didn't work out, like, what else can I do? And if this is not it, then what else? Like, what do I need to do? Just tell me what it is and I'll get it done, right? Like that was my principle at one point, where it didn't matter if like they were failures. I just had to move forward and chug along.
This kind of leads to a quick next question is, how long did it take for you to get your EB-1A? Sanika is asking, like from the moment you decided I'm going to do this, how long did that take?
Yeah, it took me about 9 to 10 months from when I decided I'm going to do this, enlisted a lawyer, and then basically submitted my petition. I think part of why it took 9 months was just because of the amount of paperwork it entails and the fact that you typically won't have a lawyer who just works on your case. So there will be some delays there. And also some part of it was just the sheer amount of evidence I had to create, right? Like writing these letters, like getting the documents in order. And then I think the challenges that you might face are things like you might work on some evidence, you'll present it to the lawyer, they'll be like, oh, yeah, but no, this is not going to work. You got to go back and do something else. So there's a lot of back and forth that happens in that process as well. So I think, yeah, even if you have a good profile, I think like you can expect to spend anywhere from, I want to say like best case would be 4 months and the longest would be 10 months, 10 to 12 months.
Yeah. What were the 4 criteria that you applied for? So it sounds like critical capacity was one, authorship was one. What else?
Yeah, so the other 2 were judging and high salary.
Perfect. So, someone was asking, what are some low-hanging criteria that I can go for? And I mentioned that
I think these are the 4.
Like judging, high salary, if you have high salary, like...
If you have it, yes, if you have it. Yeah, it's binary.
So critical capacity, judging, high salary, and authorship. Those are the things you're going for. Got it.
Yeah.
And how many artifacts did you produce, for example, for judging? Like how many competitions did you judge when you applied?
Yeah, I did about 4 or 5, but I didn't need to do that many. I think they only used one in my case, in my petition finally. But yeah, I would say like try to do 2 or 3 just so you have some backups. And whatever I didn't use in my judging criteria, I just put in final merits.
Gotcha. So you only put the very highly reputed one in judging, and then you kept
Yeah.
everything else for final merits.
Yeah, I picked the one that was reputed and also the one that had the most relevance to my field. Like not all contests have like a healthcare arm in them, right? So there was only one that actually had like a health and wellness category. So I just picked that to put in my petition.
How high does the salary should be compared to the average salary to showcase as high salary?
Yeah, so there is a method to figuring this out. So the way, I mean, at a high level, basically what you want to do is to find a benchmark from a government database for a comparable job that has a comparable title and is also in the same location where you work. So those are the two like factors that matter. So ONET is a very good database to start with because it has like a bunch of different SOC codes. It has all the wage distribution data. So you could go on ONET and type in your job title and see what matching codes come up. And then for each code, there's a way to check for your zip code what the bell curve distribution is for the bottom 10% and the top 10%. And you want to make sure that your earnings, usually depicted in your W-2, need to be higher than that top 10% amount.
Yeah. I feel like this was just to wrap up the session. Anu actually has like an EB-1A guide that she wrote based on her experience and interviewing like 100 people and talking to 100 other people who are looking for an EB-1A. So we will be adding that as a resource within the community. It will be a paid resource, but she has given a generous discount for community members. So I think in that she goes into depth into all of the criteria and how to gather evidence for that. Highly recommend looking into that once we publish that next week within the community. Any final thoughts, Anu, as we wrap this up?
I think, first of all, like, congrats to all of you on taking the step to be here, join this community. I think Soundarya and the team are really onto something great. I truly believe that this whole immigration space is in dire need of a do-over, but I think if we all, can do our part, we can slowly start, making the changes we want to see. And yeah, as Soundarya said, I'm really excited to be onboarded as a mentor. And, pretty soon I'm going to start opening up a Calendly link for calls. So feel free to schedule time with me if you want like more one-on-one guidance. And get my discovery guide as well. Eventually we'll publish the link for that too. But I think it'll be a good resource. But yeah, I think like it takes a lot of grit and determination to pursue the EB-1A specifically. But I think it's definitely worth it. I will say that from my own experience.
Anu, thank you so much for your time. I feel like you answered pretty much every question that was asked. So very happy about that. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Yeah, my pleasure. And thanks everyone for joining. Bye.